So one of the questions asked was, big tents are what the two major political parties are often called because they try to bring together as broad a coalition of groups and ideas as possible. But why specifically big tents? I think this raises a critical question to understanding political parties because there's so many different ways to look at political parties. But in this instance, in regards to big tents ideas, the parties want to be big enough in order to do one thing, and that is to win elections. And oftentimes, in order to win elections, it will require that different groups and different factions join together to become big enough to be able to win different types of elections. Now, it matters because what election you're talking about may require different types of political parties and those factions within it. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about the different factions, the different groups within each of the big tent two major parties. And I want to start off today's Republican Party. What groups make up that particular party, the grand old party, or what is commonly referred to as the GOP? Basically, what the Republican Party is made up today are a series of conservative groups, one of them focused on fiscal matters. So typically, what you will tend to see are Republicans who support smaller government. That means smaller government funding, and that ultimately means lower taxes. Another type of conservative that you're going to see within the Republican Party is national defense or foreign policy conservatives. But really, this is there can be different brands of national defense and foreign policy conservatives. One wing or one faction of national defense conservatives could be the United States needs to be aggressive in global matters. We need to project military strength. Others would argue within the Republican Party that the United States should withdraw from global affairs, should not spend as much on international development and aid across the world. So even within this one conservative area, we could see differences among the different factions and the groups that make up the Republican Party. Another core group of today's Republican Party are social conservatives and what we oftentimes refer to as white evangelicals. Those voters who tend to be highly religious, those voters who tend to go to church at least once a week, if not more often, they are now a core constituency of the Republican Party. And so combining kind of all three of those types of conservatives, what you tend to see is a Republican Party made up predominantly of white voters and those voters who identify ideologically as being conservative. Now, to give you some sense of how, based on race and ethnicity, voters tend to break down by party identification, this is from the Pew Research Center, and they gave information about how voters first identify themselves and then how they identify if they are independent but lean to one party over the other. And I think this will give you a good sense as to the core of the Republican Party, but more importantly, how the Democratic Party is looked at. If we look at white voters in terms of their party identification, at first it seems very much a kind of tie between the three different identifiers: Republican, Democratic, and Independent. But if you ask the independents to pick a side, pick one party over the other, you'll see that here 54 to 39 Republican over Democratic in 2016. And that's not unusual. We did see it kind of merge together as almost even as it did in 1992. But in general, over time, whites have generally tended to identify with the Republican Party. Conversely, if you look at black voters, African American voters, you see a very different kind of scenario with party identification. Asking black voters here to pick a party, very different from what you see with white voters. And when you ask them, particularly the independents, the 23% of independents, to pick a side, it basically goes to Democratic. This also tends to be the trend in voting patterns, not just in how people identify themselves politically, but also in terms of how they vote. Now, a key group that's rising in both numbers in terms of our population, but also in potential political strength, are Hispanic and Latino voters. And they've been coming into the scene much earlier or much later than other groups have. But when we look at their political identification at first, it seems to be a Democratic plurality, with a third of them identifying as independent. But when you ask that third of independents to split between the two parties, you see a definite gap between Democrats and Republicans, up to 63 to 27. So that gives a little bit of an idea of how racially voters tend to look at political identification. This next sets of charts looks at two key groups, again, white, but now we're introducing religion into the picture. And how do white, non-Hispanic, evangelical Protestants, social conservatives, how do they tend to identify as Republican, lean Republican versus Democratic, lean Democratic, but then also compare that to black, non-Hispanic Protestant voters. In looking at white evangelical Protestants, you've seen the gap grow considerably from 1992, where it was a 60-30 split, to now basically 3/4 of white evangelical Protestants tend to identify as either Republican or lean Republican. That is a core constituency that has become part of the Republican Party. Among black non-Hispanic Protestant voters, again, very much a Democratic-dominated constituency. Now, speaking of today's Democratic Party, what we tend to see, again, are groups of voters, much like in the Republican Party, but very different based on race, ethnicity, education, and age. Primarily, today's Democratic Party is made up of voters of color, black African American, Hispanic Latino, Asian American. Many voters of color tend to identify with the Democratic Party, along with those who have typically higher education. There's becoming a kind of education gap in voter behavior. Those folks with college, a college degree, or post-college, a graduate degree, tend to be much more Democratic in identification and in voting patterns. We typically tend to see younger voters, particularly millennials and Gen Zs, strongly identify with the Democratic Party. And then in terms of ideological perspectives, today's Democratic Party is very much a mixture of progressives and liberals and moderates, much more so than the Republican Party, dominated by conservatives. And I want to show a couple of key graphs that kind of illustrate this from the Democratic side, and then we'll go back and compare the two parties in terms of its ideological makeup. If you look at the North Carolina Democratic primary, and the voters that voted just recently in that primary, there was an exit poll done, and they asked the ideology of the voters. Are you very liberal? 23%. Are you somewhat liberal? A little over a third. But notice, in North Carolina at least, moderate to conservative voters tend to be the plurality, 41%. Now, when you ask each of these groups, how did you vote? Did you vote for Biden, Bernie Sanders, or some other candidate? Among the very liberal Democratic voters, a plurality, nearly 40%, voted for Bernie Sanders. Not too surprising. Among somewhat liberal voters, much more so towards Joe Biden and to others, where Bernie Sanders falls to 23%. And among those who identified as moderate or conservative, overwhelmingly, almost a majority for Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, the progressive, very liberal candidate, dropped to 16%. So that gives you a sense of what kind of coalitions may exist within a political party, for example, here in North Carolina. Another key question on the exit poll was, should we replace all private health insurance with a single government plan for everyone? This has been one of the key debates within the Democratic Party, as Bernie Sanders has been advocating for basically Medicare for all, government insurance for health care for all, whereas Joe Biden has taken a more, shall we say, center-left approach. But notice that among North Carolina Democratic primary voters, a majority of them support the idea of replacing private health insurance with a single government plan. And not surprising, those who support that idea were fairly evenly split, but with Bernie Sanders leading 36 to 34. More impressively were those who opposed this idea, about 40%, and they went overwhelmingly for Joe Biden. So I think that kind of illustrates the differences within one political party over a core issue like healthcare coverage. The other key question that I found of interest in the exit poll for Democratic primary voters in North Carolina was their opinion of socialism. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of socialism? Now, oftentimes, as we talked in class, a lot of people don't know what socialism necessarily entails, and that we in the United States actually have socialistic tendencies within both our economy and within the government. But this was just a kind of open question. Are you favorable or unfavorable to the idea of socialism? Those who are favorable, 50%. Again, kind of like with government health care for all, split very evenly amongst all three groups, Biden, Sanders, and others. But those who had an unfavorable opinion, overwhelmingly a majority, went for Joe Biden. So I think these kind of pose the question about political parties, and the question for a lot of political scientists is, have these parties sorted themselves into ideologically coherent groups? Now, this real question boils down to, is ideology equal to or not equal to partisan identification or partisanship? And there is one argument within political science that ideology and partisanship aren't necessarily connected, that you can be a conservative but be within the Democratic Party. You could be a liberal but be in the Republican Party. There's another argument that says ideology and partisanship have grown more connected, and therefore the parties have sorted themselves into much more of liberals in the Democratic Party, conservatives in the Republican Party. And I think what's important to look at is kind of partisan identification. How do you identify? And then what is the ideology within those specific party identifications? And I want to show two surveys, one from 1972 and one from 2016, and let you kind of decide what has happened with ideology and partisan identification. So this is the 1972 American National Elections Survey. Again, this is done massively within presidential years, and they asked for the respondents' party identification based on strength. We've talked about this before, strong Democratic to strong Republican, independent in the middle. And then they ask, what ideology do you adhere to? Everything from extremely liberal to extremely conservative, or don't know, haven't thought about ideology. In 1972, for strong Democrats, you see over 30% haven't really given a whole lot of thought, but you do have over 30% identifying in some way as a liberal. A good number are moderate, middle of the road. As you move down the partisan identification levels, you tend to see from strong Democrat to weak Democrat, the number of liberals have dropped. Among independents, what's interesting is that less than 20% don't know or haven't thought about it, meaning that they have thought about their ideological perspective, and in fact, liberals were the most within the independent Democrats of the three Democratic identifiers. Notice, however, you still got some conservatives. Independents, fairly evenly distributed, but almost 40% don't know or hadn't thought about their ideological perspective. Once you move into Republicans, again, similarly with independent Republicans and independent Democrats, smaller numbers, not sure of where their ideological perspective is. You go to weak Republicans and then strong Republicans. And what's interesting to note is looking at the strong partisans. So strong Democrats, 31% of them consider themselves some kind of liberal. Among strong Republicans, 48% consider themselves conservative in some way, shape, or form. But notice within the other partisan identifiers, so strong Democrat, weak Democrat, and independent Democrat, there are conservatives that identified themselves in 1972 belonging to Democrats. Among Republicans, independent, weak, and strong Republicans, not as many liberals as there are conservatives within the Democratic Party, but still a mixture going down as you increase in partisan strength. Now, think about this graph, and in particularly strong Democrats at 31% liberal, strong Republicans at 48% conservative. Watch what happens in 2016. Among strong Democrats, it increases to 49% liberal. Almost half of strong Democrats identify as a liberal in some way. 19 points more liberal. On the strong Republican side, an even greater increase, now 3/4. 77% identify with a conservative ideology. That's increased 30 points more conservative. And then notice the cross-cutting ideological perspectives. The conservative Democrats have shrunk, and among Republicans, liberals have shrunk even greater to where almost among strong Republicans, they're non-existent. The other interesting factor to think about, again, you're seeing less than 20%, in fact about 15% among independent Republicans, not sure of their ideological perspective. That's the greatest amount of ideological sorting going on. Among the independents, they've grown to well over 40%, nearly 45%, not sure. So there may be some of this ideological sorting going on within the parties. But the parties are indeed big tents. They tend to be affiliated groups seeking to win elections. And again, think about political parties not as just big tents, but really can be seen in three distinctive ways. Parties in the electorate, the voters that represent the two political parties. Those party organizations, their workers, the activists, perhaps even candidates. And then parties in government, the actual elected officials. And the question I think you need to ask are a couple of things. One is the sorting of voters within parties based on ideology. Have the parties basically brought in their respective thinking voters in terms of conservatism versus liberalism? But another key question to think about for political parties is kind of a two-parter. First, how can the organizations and the candidates themselves energize their party voters to get elected, or do candidates and parties persuade voters, perhaps voters who are not aligned with them, but try to bring them in an electoral coalition to build that big tent?